The tyranny of man's law ends here. Only divine law shall govern us, and by God's grace, we are free.
Today, I want to tell you about a single speech, a sermon, actually, that sent these incredible shockwaves from a tiny island in the Caribbean all the way to the royal court of Spain. And, you can argue, all the way into our modern idea of human rights. And it all starts with a defiant shout, frozen in stone.
So if you ever walk along the coast in Santo Domingo, you absolutely cannot miss this thing. It's a 15-meter tall statue of a man, just carved out of stone, with his mouth wide open like he's in the middle of a yell. It's a really powerful image. But who is this guy, and what could he possibly be shouting about?
You know, his story really makes you wonder about a huge question. We talk a lot about the power of words, right? But can one person with just one speech actually change the course of history? Well, let's find out.
Okay, let's travel back in time. The year is 1511. It's just before Christmas on the island of Hispaniola, which was the first major Spanish colony in the Americas. Picture a simple church, but it's packed with all the big shots. Colonists, conquistadors, officials, even Christopher Columbus's own son is there. And a Dominican friar named Antonio de Montesinos walks up to the pulpit. What he's about to say, nobody is ever gonna forget. He kicks things off by quoting the Bible, but he immediately turns it on them. He tells this packed church that he is a voice crying out in the wilderness of their colony, and that they better listen up because this voice, he says, is going to be the strangest, the harshest, and hardest that you ever heard or expected to hear. And then he gets right to it. He looks out at all these men who are making fortunes from the gold mines and plantations, and he asks this question that just cuts right to the bone of everything they're doing. He's not just questioning their behavior, he's questioning their right to do it at all. And this was the moral bombshell. At a time when indigenous people were basically seen as nothing more than tools for labor, Montesinos forces everyone in that room to look them in the eye and see another human being. Are they not men? By asking that, he was doing more than making a point. He was straight up accusing them of living in mortal sin. So to really get why this was so explosive, you have to understand the world Montesinos was shouting at. This wasn't just a few bad apples. This was systemic cruelty baked into colonial policy. The whole system was called the encomienda. Now, on paper, the idea was that colonists would protect and Christianize the native people. But in reality, it was a green light for slavery. The Spanish colonists were handed huge plots of land, and all the people living on that land were basically handed over to them as forced labor.
And the results were just catastrophic. I mean, the scale of the devastation is hard to even wrap your head around. Within just one generation of Columbus's arrival, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the native Taino people were just gone. Wiped out by disease, yeah, but also by the brutal forced labor that Montesinos was screaming about.
So, as you can probably imagine, telling the most powerful people in the colony that they're all headed straight for hell, well, it did not go over well. The sermon caused an immediate, massive uproar that went from a local scandal to a full-blown international incident.
The governor, Diego Columbus, he leads a whole delegation demanding that Montesinos retract his sermon. Montesinos and his fellow friars, they refuse. In fact, they double down. They threaten to deny confession to any slaveholder, which for a devout Catholic in the 16th century was a huge deal. So the colonists just went over their heads, complained directly to the king, and Montesinos got summoned back to Spain to answer for what he did.
And at first it looked really bad. King Ferdinand II's reaction was pure anger. He called the friars' words a dangerous opinion. It really seemed like this one act of defiance was about to get completely crushed by the Spanish Empire.
But this is where the story takes this amazing turn. Montesinos, standing face to face with the King of Spain, did not back down. He argued his case, and he was so persuasive that he managed to turn what should have been a royal scolding into the very first debate on human rights in the Americas.
And he got actual results. Within a year, King Ferdinand put together a commission that came up with the laws of Burgos. Now, these laws were flawed, they weren't always enforced, but they were historic. It was the very first time anyone tried to regulate how indigenous people were treated and legally recognize them as human beings with rights. All of that came directly from that one sermon, and it paved the way for even stronger new laws later on in 1542. So yeah, this sermon had an immediate legal effect.
But its real legacy is so much bigger than that. It created this moral echo that has been bouncing around for over 500 years, and it actually influenced how we even think about international law today.
And maybe the most important person to hear that sermon wasn't the governor, but a young slaveholder, a guy named Bartolomé de las Casas. Montesinos' words just got stuck in his head. A few years later, he gave up all of his slaves and dedicated the rest of his life, the next 50 years, to becoming the most famous and relentless defender of indigenous rights in history.
I mean, you can draw a perfectly straight line from that one moment. Montesinos lights the match, that spark catches on with Las Casas, who turns it into this raging fire of advocacy, and the debates that Las Casas starts, well, they lay the foundation for early ideas about international law, which eventually flow into the stream of thinking that gives us our modern concept of universal human rights.
And it all started right here. This is the Convento de los Dominicos in Santo Domingo. This is the place where Montesinos and his small group of friars talked and debated and planned their moral attack on the whole colonial system. It's not an exaggeration to call it the cradle of human rights in the Americas.
And what happened to Montesinos himself? Well, that one act of courage pretty much defined his entire life. He kept fighting and was eventually named Protector of the Indians in Venezuela. But when you fight powerful people, you make powerful enemies. In 1540, he was murdered, becoming a martyr for the very cause he had started 3 decades before.
Which brings us right back to where we started. That defiant statue on the coast, it's not just a monument to one man. It's a monument to an idea. The idea that no person is outside the circle of our shared humanity. It marks the very moment that idea was shouted out, loud and clear for the first time in the Americas.
So, can one speech change the world? The story of Antonio de Montesinos seems to prove that it absolutely can. It can spark a change that ripples out for centuries. It's a reminder that a single voice, crying out against injustice, can be the very first echo of a revolution. And that just leaves us with one final thought. Whose wilderness are we living in? And whose voice needs to be heard today?